Hey everyone, welcome again to another episode of Hemp Hotline. I'm so grateful to have Mary Beth back from Encore Labs and to talk to us today about residual solvents. I'm truly grateful for just the wisdom and the knowledge that she possesses, and I'm really grateful for Encore Labs, the opportunity to continue to educate you, the community. So today's topic is residual solvents. And for those of you who do not know, residual solvents in pharmaceuticals are defined as organic volatile chemicals that are used or processed in the manufacture of drug substances and in the preparation of a drug product. So most concentrates are extracted using a solvent such as supercritical CO2, butane, propane, other hydrocarbons, water, alcohol. And these solvents are used to extract out the cannabinoids and terpenes from the plant material. And in some cases, the solvents and impurities from the solvent remain in the extracting material, and these are called residual solvents. They're basically the byproducts of the extraction process. In some cases, these impurities can be toxic, which is why lab testing is so important when it comes to cannabis and hemp. So thank you, Mary Beth, for being here. I appreciate it.
No problem, Bevan. That was a great summary of what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a nerd, like we talked before, and when it comes to learning these things, it's important. And for me as an educator, this is something that most people don't talk about, especially like me and you talked, and I mentioned a lot of the community members have issues like recovering from cancer, and there's things that they just can't take, or we will lower their system. And so it's important for everybody to understand what residual solvent is, how it's being tested, and why it's important to have a conversation about it. So
For sure.
yeah, so let's just talk more about it. Like from your perspective, can you just dive more when it comes to residual solvent from your end and how it affects you at the lab, and then we could just jump in to explaining to the community why it's important to
Yeah.
test.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of like you said, to just like expound on that a little bit, I think when people hear residual solvents, they, at least from my perspective, when we talk about residual solvents, when it comes to like hemp and cannabis, we are a specifically a cannabis testing lab. So a lot of times I'll use that interchangeably with hemp products or CBD products. So just so your viewers know. When we talk about that, I think for me getting into this industry, I was like, well, why are there solvents on flowers? Like why would there be why would that be an issue? But the kind of the real answer is like it's not. What we're really testing for residual solvents are cannabis products, not necessarily flower that's been just like cultivated and dried, but we're talking about concentrate oils, distillates that are in pens, anything like a tincture, anything that is not in the form of the flower, anything that has to be processed and manufactured. That's where we're going to find your residual solvents. Like you said, there's a few different types of ways that the cannabinoids and terpenes that we're interested in that have therapeutic effects can be extracted or removed from the flower and turned into different products. And each one of those kind of has its own strengths and weaknesses and possibilities for the introduction of harmful residual solvents. For instance, I would say, especially historically, but maybe a little less now, the most common forms of extraction were with butane and propane. Now, butane and propane we think of as like lighters, fuel for our, grills, things like that. But we don't necessarily, when we use butane lighters, want to be just strictly inhaling butane. So obviously we don't want our products to have a lot of butane left in them after the extraction process. And kind of one of the biggest introductions of the most harmful residual solvents are if an extraction process is using a butane or a propane or any other type of solvent to do that extraction of those cannabinoids to create that oil. But say their butane has other solvents in it. So when you buy solvents, when you buy chemicals as a lab like ours, or as an extraction lab, or any other facility that might be doing manufacturing, you have a lot of different grades of those solvents. So the higher the grade, the more pure it is. Obviously, the more expensive it is as well, because it's more expensive to manufacture solvents that are really, really clean, that are very pure. 99.9% of this is butane. So sometimes, you might have a company who's doing extraction that might cut a corner, cut cost, and say, well, this 97% purity, that's probably good enough. And, maybe it is for their uses, but what they're introducing there is the possibility of that last percentage being a contaminant of some kind. A lot of the things we're looking for that are the most like carcinogenic or harmful for users of cannabis products are things like benzene, chloroform, methylene chloride, kind of things that you hear like that by name are bad for you, but you're not really sure where they come from or how you're being exposed to them. It's honestly not dissimilar here, because it's not like people doing extractions are using, pure benzene. It's they don't necessarily know where the source of that is coming from. It may be a lot of these solvents are popular in like removing things like paint or grease or anything like that. So you may even have a large like industrial level extraction process set up where they've unknowingly used like a lubricant or something like that in the system that has some of these solvents in it. So that's that's another reason why we need to be testing products to make sure that anywhere where a harmful solvent like this got introduced to the process, we're making sure that it's not in a harmful level at the end product.
Okay.
So that's kind of like a summary of like how these would get introduced to products in the first place.
Awesome. So can you briefly describe how the testing process goes? Like when you get a product from start to finish, can you just give us an overview of how it works?
Sure. So for solvents testing in particular, a lot of the main kind of culprits of high solvents because of the way they're manufactured are cartridges. So say we have a large batch of cartridges that a distributor wants to sell to a licensed dispensary. They have to be able to have a COA from our lab that says it's clean. So we can't test each cartridge individually, so we do what's referred to as batch testing. And the Bureau of Cannabis Control here in California sets minimum limits for how many samples we have to pull to be a representative of that batch. So for, say 3,000 cartridges, we pull 20 of them from different, parts in the manufacturing process. So we have 20 cartridges that we then recombine all of the oil into one place, into one vessel that we so that we know we have a good representative sample of that batch. We don't want to take one cartridge and say, okay, this is exactly what the whole batch is like. We want to take a good portion of them, combine them all into one. What we do for solvents is, in particular, is we would weigh out the amount that we're going to test in an area that's separate from where we do a lot of our other sample prep, because we use some of the solvents that we test for when we do the sampling process. So like methanol is a very common solvent in our lab because we use it for all of our extractions to be able to test for what we're looking for. So obviously we don't want to submit these clean samples to that solvent rich environment. So we specifically weigh them out in a designated area that's more solvent free than the rest of our lab. So that's an extra step of kind of precaution that we take to make sure we're getting accurate results for all of our products. A small portion of what we've combined all together is weighed. That amount is set by the Bureau of Cannabis Control as well. We have to test a specific amount for solvents in particular. It's only 1/4 of a gram. So we take 1/4 of a gram of the sample, put it into essentially like a test tube, but a headspace file, more accurately, but it's kind of like a test tube type device. And we add a liquid to it so that it's not just us, so you can't really, the kind of dirty secret of all of this is it's not like you can just take the product, put it onto the instrument, and it tells you exactly what you need to know. You kind of have to get the sample ready for our instrumentation to be able to test it properly. So we add a solvent to it that helps the instrument give more accurate results simply by putting it into solution. It kind of gets a little nitty gritty in terms of the scientific helpfulness of it. And then once we have our little vial that has our sample in it, has a little bit of solvent in it, we put it onto an instrument called a GCMS. What that stands for is gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. And you can think about that in two parts. The GC, what a gas chromatograph does is separates the sample into its component parts. So kind of like if I put a dot of ink onto a sheet of paper, and then I put that sheet of paper into like a water or something like that, you might see the ink travel up the paper and separate into bands. That's chromatography. So that's what we're doing when we insert a sample onto one of our instruments, is we're literally separating it into different component parts. So once those component parts are separated from one another, is put through the second part of the instrument, the MS or the mass spectrometer, and that's what tells us what each of those parts is. So it's a matter of separation and then characterization. So when the sample is put into the instrument and it's separated, we are able to see that it's been separated into individual peaks, but we still don't know what each of those individual peaks is. So we have to have the MS, which is a very complex, instrumentation. Kind of the most expensive analytical instrumentation is that mass spectrometer, just because it has to be incredibly specialized to be able to. We use mass spectrometers for pretty much everything that we test for in our lab. It has to be able to determine, the difference between 60 different pesticides, let alone the 20 different residual solvents that we use. So that's a pretty complex part of the whole system. And it's a big reason why, this kind of testing can't just go on in-house at the manufacturer, or like obviously home users aren't going to just fire up their GCMS. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment that each lab has to have for each individual test that they do. So we have a GCMS that we test solvents on, a GCMS that we test terpenes on, and an MS that we use for pesticides, like I said, another type of MS that we use for heavy metals. So that it has this really big library that can tell us, hey, this is a solvent that shouldn't be in your product. And then, so once we get those results, we're able to kind of review it, make sure that data is robust, is correct, and report that back to the customer.
Oh, awesome. So those of you, all of you watching right now, I want to quickly go back to something you said, that even though we're talking about cannabis, this also applies to hemp. Just like you can vape THC products, you can vape CBD products. And so I have another question to relate to that, but Craig asks, how do you set up the MS to read on equal
Yeah.
graphs for all solvents?
Yeah. So when we set up the instrument on a relatively regular basis, we have to do a calibration. So we have to tell the instrument how much of each solvent it's looking for. So I'm actually going to use a little whiteboard because I think it'll help. So when we set up the instrument, what we have to do is purchase a standard from a standards company. Typically, those standards do a lot of that work for us. So if when we purchase a standard, if it has 20 different solvents in it, then each one of those solvents will be present at the same amount in that standard. So if we buy 1,000 ppm standard parts per million, so 1,000 parts per million standard has that much of each solvent in it. So it kind of gives us a place to start from. So if we show that, if we tell the instrument this point is what 1,000 ppms looks like, and then we take that same standard and we prepare it at half strength. So this is what 500 ppms looks like. And then we might prepare a quarter strength. So this is what 250 ppms looks like, and so on. And once the instrument has those points, it draws a line through them. And each time I now run an unknown, if I have a sample that comes out here on the instrument, then the instrument knows, well, it's between 250 and 500. This gets into your algebra lesson, right? This is, y equals mx plus b. I know there's a lot of people probably rolling their eyes, but you have a y point that's this, and an x point that's this, and the y-intercept for us is typically close to 0. And that the slope of that line tells you, well, this is, we'll say 375, because it's right in between those other 2 points. And we're able to determine that based on an equation that the instrument makes. So in terms of having all of the solvents on the same concentration level, it has a lot to do with how the standards that we use themselves are manufactured. But once we buy that calibration standard, which is also, another reason why not everyone can just whip up a testing lab at home, is there's a lot of funding that goes into buying those standards, making sure that your instruments have been properly calibrated. We have a lot of quality checks built in that the BCC regulates. So like every day we have to inject a standard so that we can prove our instrument is within a range of accuracy here. So we inject a standard every single day that we tell the instrument, okay, this is supposed to be this concentration, and it has to be within a certain window for us to say that the instrument has been properly calibrated.
Awesome. Thank you. Love the graph. Thank you. Hey, Craig, I hope that's so cool. Thank you for doing that. Craig, I hope that answered your question. If you need us to elaborate, please just ask there. So, how do I put this? How often do you see a fail rate compared to testing for THC products and also for CBD products?
Sure, great question. It is rare that we get a failure for solvents. I think a lot of failures happen with people who are new to the extraction process. If they don't know exactly what the purity of their extraction solvents needs to be, if they don't know exactly how to what we call purge the product to get rid of all those extra solvents after they have a finished oil. there may be some solvents still hanging out. In terms of a comparison between THC and CBD, I think one of the things that we test a decent amount that is pretty susceptible to solvent contaminations is isolate, is CBD isolate. And one of the reasons is because the isolation process has to happen at the very end. So the way I kind of was thinking about this earlier today is like, think about your so you want a CBD isolate. What that is just like literally powdered CBD. But to get to that point, you have to take a large crop of flower and isolate just that part of it, right? So think about it like you have an apple orchard full of apple trees, and that's like your product that you're trying to get CBD from. And if your whole apple orchard has one tree that has bad apples on it, when you take all the apples off of those trees and put them into one barrel, or say 5 barrels, you've taken this huge crop of trees and you put it into a smaller space of barrels, and now more of the apples in those barrels seemingly are bad. There's a more concentrated amount of bad apples. Then say you took those apples and you made apple juice, and you literally an even smaller, you've concentrated that large amount of apples into an even smaller space, and you're using even less of it. So now that bad apple can affect the juice even more, because you're just making it as smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's kind of how I think about CBD isolate. When you're talking about extracting to get an oil, you have to extract first. You have to distill that product to get a CBD oil. And then from that CBD oil, you have to use chromatography again to separate a very specific portion of that oil into CBD. So if you think about getting down to that like very fine level, it's just like the juice that has more, the bad apples have more of an effect on the juice than they did when it was just this giant orchard full of apple trees. So, but the kind of like good news about that is when you have CBD isolate and you're using that to create products, you may only be using a really small amount of that isolate to make a large batch or a large oil. So ultimately, if you have a failing amount of solvent or there's a solvent present in that isolate, unless you're ingesting that isolate all on its own, which odds are you're not, the product that it's going into will then diffuse that solvent into larger amounts. So the large amount, kind of like when you're filling your car up with gas, you can smell the fumes. It really overwhelms you, but it's not like you're just inhaling the gas right from the tank or sitting in a room that's filled with gas. It's dispersing into the air. So it's less harmful in the long run because it's being diluted. Does that kind of make sense?
It does make sense. So Craig has asked a question. Is there no period reduction in contaminants through the distillation process?
Sure. So basically, I think what he's asking is like, wouldn't a distillation process get rid of some of the contaminants that are in the oil to begin with? And the answer is yes, if the person doing the distillation knows what they're doing. So if a product is, if a product is responsibly and accurately extracted and then responsibly and accurately distilled, and then you isolate the CBD from it. Ideally you don't have contaminants left over. But a lot of what this industry is fighting is efficiency and time constraints and knowledge. So I think with those things being a factor here in such a new industry, and a lot of people trying to capitalize on it, I think that's where you run into issues with things not being properly distilled, because it does take time and know-how to really do these things. But yeah, in an ideal world, if you're distilling, I read something that actually compared flour, like just flour that's been grown and cured, or hemp, or however you want to look at that, to like a red wine. Wine is just the grapes. It's the mixture of alcohol and everything else that naturally occurs with the grapes. And THC oil or CBD oil is kind of more like a flavored vodka. Like you isolated one part of the alcohol, and then you kind of added some other things back to it, and you had to kind of manufacture it a little more artificially to get a different end product. And, obviously both of those are viable products. It just kind of depends on, do you want red wine, or do you want, Svedka? Do you want flour, or are you someone who can't smoke flour? So you need like an RSO or a live rosin that's a little more, friendly to someone who can't necessarily smoke.
That was a great analogy. And so I had a question, but you answered the question, about the distillation process. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much to learn, and for me, just you hear so many people talk about it, but they never really explain it to you in an easy format of how it works. And those of you watching, I'll see if I can work with Mary Beth and Encore Labs on doing some longer videos where we can explain the process individually for you. But yeah, this has been a great education process for me. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you for the little graph. It's. I always think about we're not gonna talk about math. We're never gonna use math, and then you come back years later, we're doing math again.
It's still haunting you, man.
So this is why it's important, to stay in school and learn and continue to educate yourself, even if it's just the basics. And so thank you so much, Mary Beth. I really appreciate you and the team for all the support you've been giving us and the opportunity to educate the community. I really appreciate it.
Of course. I hope, the analogies kind of bring everything to a little more understandable level for the non-nerds out there.
Yeah, it's so great. So thank you so much. I appreciate it always.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Appreciate you all. Please be safe, and I'll take your CBD.
There are those that said your pain isn't real. Too slow. Too hard. Too soft. Too old. Too limited. To them, we say too bad. Everyone deserves good and clean CBD.